Sahar, could you tell me a little bit about your personal history and what got you involved in your activism?
Well, mainly I grew up in West Jerusalem, which is a completely different city from East Jerusalem on that level, the Jewish-Israeli side. So I guess what kind of woke me up was to actually meet Palestinians, and the first time I actually went into East Jerusalem to the other side of town and kind of realized that there are two completely different lives going on. And I mean, I came from a city that had good schools and pavements on the streets and those kind of things, and then you cross to the other side of the city and understand that it's just not there. So that's kind of what made me start being active and understanding what's going on around me.
And you are also one of the high school refusers, and you went to prison for a period of time. Can you talk a little bit about that experience and why you chose to refuse?
Well, mainly I chose to refuse because after being active for a while, it was kind of obvious to me that, I mean, the main project that the army implements today is the occupation. And, I mean, the amount of people who go to the army and say that they're against the occupation, say that they're for two-state solution, say that they're against the settlement, and then go into the army and become a part of that system and protect the settlements and so on. I mean, if all of those people who are already against these policies would refuse to be a part of them, then these policies would change. The Israeli government would be forced to change them. So on that level, it was very obvious to me that I couldn't be a part of that system. And so together with a group of friends, we made our refusal public, wrote a letter to the Prime Minister, Minister of Defense, so on, saying that we're refusing because of the occupation, trying to kind of get Israeli society to be aware of what's going on. And then we're imprisoned as a part of that, and I spent about 2 months in prison, 3 months in detention before I was officially released on mental health.
Micha, could you give me a little bit of your personal history and why you're involved in the activism that you are?
I grew up in Jerusalem too, in the Scouts. I really wanted to be, I mean, I grew up in the 90s. In the 90s things were blowing up right and left in West Jerusalem, and I didn't know anything about what was going on in East Jerusalem. Or in the West Bank. And I was under the impression that peace was around the corner, that there would be a two-state solution. I didn't realize at that point that during the 90s the settlements had actually doubled in size, from 200 to 400,000 people. That when they were talking about the Clinton roadmap, that they were literally talking about new roads that were paved and crisscrossing the West Bank that were paved for the use of to connect settlements to one another and to connect settlements to Israel. And keeping them secure meant that Palestinians couldn't use them, which meant checkpoints and roadblocks all over the West Bank, a very tight military control over millions of people. All I saw were bombs blown up, and funerals and cemeteries and families that were falling apart. And I grew up in the Scouts, and a lot of the Scouts in Israel was preparation for military service. I was in uniform from the 4th grade. So by the time it was my turn to serve my country, I was gung-ho. I wanted to be a combat soldier. I wanted to serve. Only it was the first time for me to see Palestinian cities and settlements. My family was against the occupation to begin with, which pretty much meant we'd never go visit. I didn't know what they looked like. So the first, it turns out through my army service that I learned that our job wasn't only to protect Israeli settlers, it was to enable and support their expansion. And that's what the army does. We're under consecutive Israeli governments allowing settlers to expand their settlements or to set up new outposts on hilltops. And what we're seeing in Jerusalem today is what we saw in Hebron 10 years ago, was settlements right smack in the middle of a civilian population, expanding at the expense of the local Palestinian community, violent presence, intentionally making any peace resolution unviable. Can't happen if there are these facts on the ground. And so today we already have Knesset members that are discussing annexation of Area C, 60% or 65% of the West Bank. And Jerusalem as a capital is disappearing. And I would say that that's a loud and clear message from Israeli politicians that they're not interested in a peace resolution. And I think anyway, that's how I got involved.
And so at the moment, so originally you were involved in helping to found Breaking the Silence, and now you're involved in Grassroots Jerusalem. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about both of those projects.
Breaking the Silence is an organization. I no longer speak for Breaking the Silence. They're an organization of ex-IDF soldiers that speak out about the red lines they've crossed and the experiences, their experiences at checkpoints in controlling a civilian population. Issues that aren't discussed in Tel Aviv or in Jerusalem. It's far from the eye of mainstream Israel, and they intentionally bring it to public discussion, kind of as a moral mirror. I work in Grassroots Jerusalem today. It's a Palestinian organization. We work in different communities around Jerusalem. What people don't realize about Jerusalem, we talk about one state, two state, and Jerusalem is caught in the middle there. Jerusalem, over the last 4 decades, has been neglected as a result of Israeli policy. Jerusalemites don't have the right to vote. They're about 40% of the population in Jerusalem, but they are not represented in any political way, any democratic way. The Palestinian Authority has no jurisdiction in Jerusalem, and the Israeli government and municipalities have intentionally ignored, which means sewage and drainage are not taken care of. Waste management is very poor. There aren't very many schools, classrooms, so there's almost a 50% dropout rate. Kids are going to school in turns. Since the wall was built around Jerusalem, people can't get into work from the suburbs. Students can't come to university. Produce won't make it to the supermarkets. 5,000 businesses have shut down. As a capital, it's been drying up intentionally. And we're left with a bunch of disempowered Palestinian communities. What Grassroots Jerusalem does is, through field coordinators, find out what's going on in each one in terms of education, infrastructure, sense of security, gender issues, health, and we find out who's active there, where are the activists, where are the community-based organizations or community leaders, and work with them to connect them to NGOs or other organizations like yours that might want to be directly supportive of their development so that their voice is heard, and when it's not heard, so that we together can advocate on their behalf.
To ask you a little bit more about the broader sort of political issues that are being discussed, particularly not only within Israeli society, amongst Israeli activists would probably be a better way to put it, and Palestinian activists and Palestinian society. Obviously, probably the biggest thing that's going on in some ways internationally with Palestinian solidarity work is the boycott, divestment and sanctions campaign. I was just wondering what your thoughts on that was.
Well, mainly I think that in general the idea that focusing on the fact that the occupation today is not that conflict between Arabs and Jews or between Muslims or Jews or what all these kind of ideas that we have, but rather there's a huge bigger picture there that has to do with foreign investment, that has to do with a lot of who makes the profit out of this in the end of the line, which is definitely not the Palestinians, but also not most of the Israeli population, but rather, I mean, Israel's biggest import today is arms, is the military technology, and that means that Israel can sell this stuff because it can prove that it works. If Israel built the fence between allegedly between Palestinians and Israelis, and they have the security systems and all this technology set up, then when the U.S. wants to build a fence between Mexico and the U.S., they're going to use the same technology because they know it works, and it's Israeli companies that are implementing that in the U.S. And the same goes with drones that were used in the attack on Gaza in 2009, are later on sold to France in billions of dollars of worth of drones, and those connections have to be talked about. And then on a more kind of focused level on foreign corporations that are also involved in this, there are corporations who come into an industrial zone in the occupied territories, and not only are human rights not very much monitored there, but also labor rights, environmental rights, all of these issues are kind of a corporate Disneyland on that level. And so people are making a huge profit out of the fact that the occupation continues. And that is something that communities around the world can target and can have an effect on, of saying, no, I mean, if your company violates human rights, then that's not something that we're going to be supporting. And that's a very simple line to put down and actually have an effect. I mean, there have been campaigns going on that have cost some of these companies billions of dollars in different contracts around the world. And some of these companies have tried to get out of their involvement in the occupation. Some of them have. Some of them are stuck in contracts because no one wants to buy it off of them. Because people or corporations are starting to understand that has a price, that people around the world are willing to put a price tag on that level on your involvement in the occupation. That is a really, really important thing.
Locally, different corporations that Aussies are necessarily invested in, but Sahar was alluding to is Veolia, building the light rail connecting settlements in North Jerusalem to the center of town. And they also take care of waste and taking care of Israeli waste, dumping it on Palestinian lands in the Jordan Valley, or segregated buses from the West Bank into Jerusalem that Palestinians can't use. You use these services. You use these corporations. You hire them. You pay them. On that level, when it comes down to it, you're just complicit. This is about who's making a profit. G4S. We just today saw G4S labels all over Melbourne. G4S runs the largest military prison camp, Ofer, in the occupied territories, and takes care of surveillance there. Also in 4 or 5 other prisons inside Israel that hold Palestinian prisoners illegally, and they take care of surveillance cameras there too. And you use them in your prisons in Victoria. And in other areas, they're the largest private security company in the world. Another way to say it is the largest private militia in the world. And there's a brilliant BDS target when it comes down to it. I think it has. They're not just active in the Palestinian territories. They're active in the Congo. They're active in other in other areas of urban warfare, and not just. They're active in Western cities everywhere. They're a Danish organization, British organization, and they're in Germany and England. So I think the question needs to always be, who's making a profit? We know this all over the world. We know this in Occupy Wall Street, New York. We know it in Athens. We know it in Tahrir Square. The question is, who's making a profit? And I think that keeps it away from fear of anything that has to do with anti-Semitism. This has nothing to do with anti-Semitism or security, for that matter. It has everything to do with the global economy. Besides that, what inspires me about the BDS movement is that it has managed to suggest a grassroots movement where politicians have failed. Because politicians today can't unite the Palestinian people. They can't bring Palestinian citizens of Israel, Jerusalemites, West Bankers, Gazans, refugees. Abbas doesn't represent all these people when he stands up to the General Assembly in the United Nations, but the BDS movement can. And they'll do it from the bottom up, and they'll do it non-violently. And that's something that Israelis can support, and it's growing. And so on that level, I think, yes, I support the BDS movement.
And one of the other things I wanted to ask about was in the last year or so in particular amongst Palestinian activists, I know that there has been a discussion about the concept of co-resistance as opposed to coexistence. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on those sort of issues.
Well, I think that it came in through the fact that throughout the 90s and then the beginning of 2000s, there were all these projects bringing together Israelis and Palestinians to sit and talk and see that we're all human. And that happened, and everyone saw that everyone's human. And you'd have these kids going out to a summer camp in the U.S., meeting each other, but then coming back home, and half of them will become soldiers because they're Israelis, and that's what they have to do legally. And then they might meet the Palestinian next time back at a checkpoint. And it was kind of an understanding that you can't continue having these meetings saying we're all human without actually focusing on what the power dynamics are, and that it is I mean, it's not just a conflict between two sides that if they only learn to hold hands, everything will be fine. It has nothing to do with holding hands. It has everything to do, again, with profit, there's a larger scheme here that can be solved by knowing that we're all people. And on that level, what has to be done is taking that to the next level of saying, if we do want to work together, when we need to do that by resisting the occupation, resisting these mechanisms, resisting these corporations in all different levels. And that is a place in which we can really work together, and we have a common goal. I mean, on that level, it is not only a Palestinian struggle, it is also my struggle as a Jerusalemite who wants to live in my city, but it has to be in trying to change the system, because the system that exists today won't allow us to just live together.
Existence versus co-resistance?
Mm-hmm.
I work in Palestinian communities with Palestinian friends and colleagues now. It is obvious when we work and organize that it's not about coexistence. It's not about peace. It's not about dialogue. It's about justice and human rights and the right to self-determination and to organization and equality. And that when I work in Al-Quds is a Palestinian capital. As long as that's on the table and that's clear, then we work together, and we work together well. I think things get very confusing when we start talking about coexistence and dialogue and backstep into the 90s, because it needs to be clear. This is it's not when I hear the word peace, I hear an agreement between two equal parties. There are no two equal parties here. There's an Israeli occupation of Palestinian lands and people, and we shouldn't confuse things.
Your experience as an Israeli activist working together with Palestinians on the ground in the villages?
The experience changes from village to village. From everyone is a different community, and they have a different idea of how they want the demonstrations to look like. But what is very much clear is that we have these relationships, and the resistance does allow these relationships on a lot of levels, and very interesting conversations, very interesting interactions that I wouldn't get otherwise. And also it has had an effect. And I mean, on a small level, you can see the different victories with the fence moving here or the fence moving there. But also, I think if we're talking about a global BDS movement, it wouldn't exist without a popular resistance on the ground. And the fact that popular resistance on the ground is also made of Palestinian leadership, but joined with both international activists and Israeli activists, is also what's going on in the BDS movement globally, of saying, again, this is not a question of race or religion or ethnicity or all of these questions. We can all be on the same side of these things if it's on the ground in the different villages, or if it's here in Melbourne.
I think the dynamic that's really interesting when it comes to my participation in a village that's not my village, community that's not my community. And as an Israeli, keeping in mind that even though I might have I will have a common language with the soldiers that show up, it is not my role to negotiate with them. It is my role to stand in solidarity with the protesters, but it is their role to lead the protest. It is their role, and I'm not there to be a mediator. I'm there to stand with. Last thoughts.
Famous last words.
Yeah, personally, I've given up on politicians. I think what it comes down to is strategically building a grassroots movement, both global and local. And if you're looking for something to support, I would say actually the global movement is growing and succeeding, even though we don't hear it at mass media, but screw the mass media. We know not to trust them anyway. But we've been bouncing around. I've witnessed firsthand how things are moving, how the wheels are turning, and that it is very clear that we must be strategic. We must have long-term goals to look forward to, and understand that it's going to take certain specific moves and people to talk with and target audiences and patience to build the reality that we wish to see, and that's a shift that as activists we have to be aware of, and in a global and a local level as well. So if you're looking to support things on a local level, be in touch.